Labas vakaras, mėly Atviros Lietuvos fondo namų svečiai. Good evening, dear friends of Open Lithuanian Foundation. Good evening, Professor Klaus Segbers. If you don't mind, I'm going to say a few words in Lithuanian language, and after that we are going to return to contemporary lingua franca, English language. Taigi, aš labai džiaugiuosi, kad tiek daug žmonių susirinko šiandien į viešą paskaitą, kurios pavadinimas šių dienų pasiekimai ir iššūkiai Europos Sąjungoje, kiek visa tai rimta. Norėčiau priminti, kad tai yra diskusijų ir viešų renginių ciklo Permąstant Europą, Rethinking Europe renginys. Ir tai yra labai svarbu, kad ši paskaita surengta bendrų Giotės instituto Vilniuje ir Atviros Lietuvos fondo pastangų dėka. Todėl aš noriu labai nuoširdžiai padėkoti Giotės instituto direktoriui, ponui Detlef Görike. Ačiū Jums labai. Be Jūsų pagalbos ir bendradarbiavimo šis renginys tikriausiai nebūtų galėjęs įvykti. Ir tik keletą žodžių apie profesorių. Klaus Segbers yra globalinės politikos centro steigėjas ir direktorius bei Berlyno Laisvojo universiteto profesorius. Šis mokslininkas tyrinėja procesus lemiančius mūsų globalinę politiką, jos tendencijas, taip pat Vokietijos kuriamas bei įgyvendinamas užsienio politikos strategijas ir, kas yra labai svarbu, profesorius jau porą dešimtmečių labai atidžiai stebi procesus vykstančius postsovietiniai erdvėje arba postkomunistiniam pasaulyje. Taigi jis atvyko į tą erdvę, kuri yra jam pažįstama ne tik iš knygų, bet ir iš jo kelionių ir profesorius turi tikrai daug ryšių. Aš net nustebau, kai sužinau, kiek daug ryšių su Lietuva ir kitom vidurio rytų Europos šalim. Profesorius Klaus Segbers yra keleto prestižinių tarptautinių mokslinių organizacijų valdybos narių. Profesorius taip pat yra vizituojantis mokslininkas įvairiuose užsienio universitetuose. Jis yra dirbęs Stanfordo, Harvardo, Kolumbijos, Džordžo Vašingtono universitetuose. Taigi aš tikiuosi, kad jūs išgirsit labai įdomią paskaitą ir po to, žinoma, turėsim laiko užduoti profesoriui klausimų. Dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good evening to all of you. I'm very happy to see so many faces of different generations. Closer, yes. And let me also start with thanking those people who put a lot of effort in organizing this. So the Open Society, Open Lithuania Foundation, even more. Okay. Sandra and Gavia and the Goethe Institute, Mr. Gericke, thank you very much, and also Aurimas, who put a lot of effort in making this possible. I think he started more than a year ago to work on me to make that possible, to come here and to talk to you, and it worked finally out. So let's talk about Europe for a little bit more than an hour. Not me, but you also, with your questions and comments. And what I want to do in my introduction is basically to walk you through 4 or 5 points. The core message is that we are living in a fundamentally changed global landscape in the last 30 years. That is very important to consider, that we don't have international relations as we had them 30 years ago and before. That's my first point. The second point is, before we move on to the challenges to the EU and the crisis of the EU, to point out that the EU still, my opinion, is most of all a success story. So when we only frame it as a permanent crisis, I think it is not adequate for understanding what is happening here. But then in my third step, I will move on to indeed challenges and crises which are around, and I will talk about them for a moment. And then I will focus in particular on something which in the last 3, 4, 5 years came over us, for many quite unexpectedly, and that is what we call populism. So I will spend a while on trying to explain how to understand it and how populism is affecting European integration, And finally, I will offer some ideas and some perspectives, what I call outlook. So let me start with the changing global landscape. We are experiencing a couple of major shifts here, especially a weakening in relative terms of the United States, which is significant. At the same time, a rise of China. And both, the simultaneous development of both trends have quite an impact on the discipline of political science and international relations, because some people like Graham Allison, a very famous American political scientist, have indicated that in the past centuries, when you had one descending big power and one ascending or rising big power, in most cases this led to war. Statistically, in 2/3 of all cases when you had such a situation, it led to war. So that is certainly something we have to consider today when we look at the US and at China. At the same time, we are experiencing the effect of global flows, as I call it. We are all more and more exposed to capital flows, to content flows, to flows of people, which is migration. All these flows are border crossing. And the effect of that is that the regulation capabilities of nation states are weakening because they cannot effectively control and moderate and navigate these flows. That is another thing which is new. And finally, in the last 2 to 3 years, there is more and more talk in the media, but also among specialists and decision makers, that we are probably facing something like the end of the rule-bound Western world order, as it has been established after the Second World War, after 1945, symbolized by the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the EU, and other similar organizations. Some people, very high-level people, also talk about the derailing world, so that are quite dramatic characterizations of the changes we are experiencing. The last thing I would like to add here on this list of changes is that we, I would say, are also experiencing a world which increasingly is characterized by missing narratives. Narratives are stories which give people some kind of orientation about what is happening. During the Cold War, most people had this kind of narratives, like East versus West, the good guys versus the bad guys. Who was good depended on your own position. It didn't matter much, but you had some kind of orientation. And so today, increasingly, we find ourselves in a world where we don't quite comprehend what is going on. So these missing narrative things, I think, is very important. Also later, when we move on to the issue of populism. A couple of more things which are happening. Many of these changes, the global flows and the changing power positions of the US and China, are related to globalization. Globalization, by definition, is very ambivalent, and it has very different consequences. It's not just only bad or only good, it is both. On the one hand side, it offers many opportunities to young people, not only to young people, but it also has plenty of risks to offer for different people in different countries. We forget sometimes that in the last 30 years, more than 1 billion of people have been lifted out of poverty. I'm not talking about inequality, I'm talking about poverty, which is a big feat to achieve. But at the same time, also many people feel uprooted by global markets and by acceleration. So at the end of the day, I think it is probably very difficult to say globalization is only a very good thing or only a very bad thing. It is kind of both, depending on where you are looking. Particularly important when we talk about the effects of globalization is that more and more people, when you look at surveys, for example, at Pew Research American company surveys, more and more people, when you ask them, what are your biggest concerns for yourself? More and more people are saying uncertainties, that they do not know what's going to happen in the future to them. And this increasing awareness of uncertainties is something which I find very important when we talk about Europe and populism a little bit later. So as a result of all these developments, people increasingly are exposed to both economic and cultural risks and challenges. It is not only economic worries and concerns. Culture plays a very important role here. Okay. My next point, as I said at the beginning, how can we properly assess and evaluate the European Union? And let me start with a positive balance. The first thing which is worth mentioning is that the EU was first of all a political project to integrate, in particular, France and Germany after the Second World War, and to prevent a repetition of two world wars which emerged in the 20th century, mostly, not only, but mostly from European soil. And if you look at that, this actually materialized. After the EU has been established on the territory of the EU, we did not have another big war. Now, when I make this point in my classes in Berlin and talk to the students there, sometimes I look in faces and see they don't understand what I'm talking about. What war, right? I mean, it is good for my students and for many people in the room here as well. It is very good that they did not have personal exposure to war. But when you are a little bit older, you know what that was. And so, while young people tend to discount that, of course no war. Why war, right? It is not like of course. And I think that is a very big plus on the plus side, on the positive side, we should not forget about. In addition to that, the EU also managed in the last 30 years to do a lot of stabilization by just being around and just being a potential object of the desire for other societies to join. Because for joining the EU, you all know that you have to fulfill certain conditions, including not having ongoing conflicts, including minority and other conflicts. And so by the pure existence of the EU and the possibility of inviting new candidates, there was a contribution to calming down, to some extent, actual and potential conflicts. That is what we may call stabilization through extension. Also, while we focus so much on Euro crisis and migration, there are two policy fields out of dozens of policy fields which are integrated in Europe. And by far the big majority of integration works just good in many policy fields. So we should not overlook that the core idea to integrate many, many policy fields in a supranational organization still works mostly quite well. This is due particularly to a whole fabric, a patchwork of rules and institutions. And this is interesting to mention because some of my colleagues, the so-called realist school of international politics, still flatly deny that something like that is possible. They mostly say that states are only out for survival. They are notoriously skeptical about each other. They cannot cooperate over time. It's not going to happen, right? And so when you look at the history of the EU, you see it actually can happen, and it does happen. Not always, and not in all policy fields, but in many areas, cooperation does work. So that's also worth mentioning. Free movement internally of goods, of services, of finances, and of people. Here again, when I mention that with my students, they say, what? Free movement? Why not? Right? But when I was like your age, many people in the room here, and we were crossing borders in Western Europe, we actually had to show our passports and ID cards. So that is also something which has gone for good, and that is also one thing which belongs on this list of positive effects. If the EU would be just a terrible, mismanaged, ineffective organization, we probably would not have a waiting list. And we still have a waiting list of candidates who want to join. So there must be a reason for that. I'm not saying and not anticipating that most of these candidate countries can join soon, but some may join in a few years. I come to that later. And other maybe at least have the opportunity to keep that as an orientation. And finally, it is worth mentioning that we are not only talking about the EU proper, but when we talk about it, we have to be aware that there is a broader perimeter around the EU. That is what we call the European neighborhood policy. And I brought you a map to get some impression about that. So what you see here in dark blue is the current membership state of the EU. What you see in light blue are the current official candidates for membership. But what you see in dark brown are all those countries in Eastern Europe and in Northern Africa and the MENA area, which belong to the European neighborhood policy. So when you look at all these countries together, you come to the conclusion that the EU probably is a very strong geopolitical factor. Look at the size, right? Look at the borders and all of this. I think that is probably not the case to label the EU as a strong geopolitical factor, but it is useful to have a look here at this map and see how far European stability policy is reaching, and also combined with the question if our feeling of responsibility for these spaces is actually there where it should be when we see this kind of map and the spread of this map. So that was the point along the positive factors and achievements. And now let me move on to the side of the challenges. I have two slides here, one political and one economic one. And let me start with the political challenges. Number one is terrorism. Europe was in a situation until 5-6 years ago that terrorism was something which was happening far away, but not in Europe proper. In the last couple of years, we had to learn the hard way that terrorism can happen and is happening any place at any time. There are only two countries which had a similar experience before, in the 1970s. In Italy, the Brigate Rosse, and in Germany, the Red Army faction. But most of the other countries didn't know that, and Northern Ireland, of course. But more recently, it comes to Europe, it comes back to Europe. And what is interesting and important to note when we think about what to do with that is that this is surprisingly not a very political terrorism, what we are facing now, because there is nothing like that any kind of group sends a list of claims and expectations to a government and tells the government, if you do not fulfill this, we will hit you. That's not happening. Instead, they just come and hit. And the question is why? And there are a lot of clever people who analyze that, who come to the conclusion that the basic aim of this terrorist action is attention grabbing. And I tend to agree with that. The more attention you produce by attacks, the better your chances are in terms of collecting funding, and the better your chances are in recruitment of future terrorists. So the media in Western countries are the door opener for this kind of actions because they obviously report about these actions. And the more blood on the street, the more reporting by the media. The bad news is there is not much we can do about it because we understand ourselves as liberal countries in Europe, as free countries with free media. And obviously the media are reporting about that, right? So this attention grabbing, unfortunately, works. So the bad news here is that the regularity of terrorist actions and attacks in Europe is probably something what we may call a new normalcy. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. The second issue, you all know that, is, and I call it deliberately this way, unregulated migration. I do not call it refugee crisis, and there are reasons for that. Unregulated migration is a major thing which is perceived in many European societies as something which comes too quickly, which is too much, and which is out of control. And most of these perceptions matter politically. It does not matter so much if we personally agree with that. It matters that many people, more and more people in many societies perceive it as out of control. That is what matters politically. We can come back to that in the discussion if you want. You see, I put on 4 new features here because they are new in comparison with immigration to Europe after the Second World War. To give you a quick assessment, to West Germany alone, only to West Germany, after 1945 came 12 million German refugees from the former Eastern territories in Europe, 8 million guest workers in the 1960s and 70s, and 4 million people from the former Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Altogether 23 to 24 million people to West Germany. By and large, they have been integrated more or less okay. If you compare that with those people who come in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, already less so in 2017, the big difference is that 90%, up to 90% of those people who came in the last couple of years are Muslims. Out of those, 90% are male. This combination is a problem because those people come into Western societies who have secular orders, who do not accept to prioritize religious norms over state norms, who have certain rules for the status and the position of women in our societies and other things. And not all of that is easily digestible by those people who are coming in. Another thing is, when you look at the map again, which I showed you before, in our immediate neighborhood southward in Northern Africa, we are having right now about 6 failing states. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Sudan. Each of these states is fueling migration. It is not clear if and how Western countries can restabilize these failing states, and if there would be a consensus in the societies to fund that and to get into the conflicts which is required to stabilize them. And the final thing is that may be surprising for you, that development aid, what our governments are talking about often, have quite unintentional consequences, as we know from many studies by now. The more development aid you give to African countries, the sooner you experience social mobility upward. So poorer people move upward into lower middle classes, and that means then you enable them to have money, to have enough money for buying tickets and for paying smugglers. So in this sense, giving more and more development aid is programming more and more people to come to Europe. When you combine that with demographic forecasts for Africa, there will be a triple rise of demographics until 2050. So when you see all that in a context, you see the real magnitude of this challenge. It is much, much more what we have to cope with than this 1.5 million people who came in 2015 and 2016. The next challenge is what we call spoilers. We are increasingly facing neighbors, unfortunately even members of the EU who are not particularly fond of rule acceptance and following the rules, especially Russia from a European perspective, also Turkey, the member states Hungary and Poland, and unfortunately also the United States of America, who violated plenty of rules, withdrew from many of international agreements in the last 2 to 3 years. And this challenge means, how do we address these kind of challenges? Do we let it slip? Do we tell them, oh, you, that's not good to do? Do we have any kind of sanctions? Do we have any kind of signals we want to send to them? So that is pretty new. We never before, after 1945, had a situation like this one, that we have increasingly governments, decision makers, who say that they are not willing to observe certain rules, what they may have done before. Security. In many parts of Europe, I guess particularly also here in this part of Europe, that is a major issue. For guaranteeing security, we do not only have European Union, we also have NATO. When you travel a lot and when you talk to many people internationally, you will easily figure out that the established and crucial credibility of NATO, especially Article 5, when one NATO member is attacked, the other NATO members will perceive that as an attack on everyone, is maybe not credible today anymore. Why? Because the American president and many people in his administration have plenty of statements and plenty of comments from which you can learn that American assistance in the case of a conflict in Europe may be conditional. For example, we may consider helping you, but only when you have paid your bills, or when you have invested a certain amount of money in your own armament and defense capabilities. So when you make statements like this, the credibility of the whole organization is undermined and weakened. And that is exactly the situation in which we find ourselves today. That is not a very convenient position. Brexit. Brexit is happening. I think that is fair to say. All hopes there may be another referendum with a different outcome are nice to have, but not very likely to materialize. As of today, I would say that the chances of any kind of agreement on Brexit is about 50-50. There are still very, very significant problems. UK wants to stay in the customs union, but not to stay in the other unions, especially not on services and finances, and particularly not on migration between EU citizens. That is something what the EU negotiators call cherry picking, and they do not want to accept that with a reason, because when we accept it in the case of the UK, we implicitly send incentives to other countries who also may consider leaving. Oh, I can leave certain ways of integration and I can stay in others, right? So I can make a selection here. That is why this issue is very tough. And the second issue is the issue of the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is absolutely unclear how this can be solved. Northern Ireland is part of the UK. When the UK leaves, Northern Ireland has to leave as well. When you don't want that, you can suggest, as Mr. Barnier, okay, then Northern Ireland can be treated as the Republic of Ireland. But then you have a border inside the United Kingdom between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, which is also not viable from the position of the British government. So that is the second big block of contention, which is so far not resolved. So you have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues, which I think from a political perspective are right now the crucial ones, and they are definitely not easy to solve. Let me move on to the economic part of the equation. You find today less reports in the media about the euro crisis. Unfortunately, that does not mean that the euro crisis is solved. It is not. The core problem about the euro is that it was introduced in a hurry around 1990 as an economic project to reduce the necessity of companies who trade between EU member states to change currencies and to pay fees for the exchange. But the second reason was a political one, and that was German unification. German unification was by far not very popular when it happened, or when it was kind of in sight. The Western neighbors were highly skeptical about German unification, especially in London, in Paris, and in Rome. And in this kind of situation, the German government agreed to abolish the German mark, the Deutsche Mark, and the strong position of the Bundesbank, and agree with the introduction of the euro as some kind of hedging against German assertiveness. And because everything had to move very quickly in this concrete situation, we have a currency union, but we do not have a social and a fiscal union. That is very important. Because in this situation, we have the European Central Bank making decisions about the currency, but we have still national parliaments making decisions about social policy and budget policy. And this over time cannot work. So either we have to make a step forward and adding a social and fiscal union, which is frankly not possible, because in a couple of countries we have to do then referenda, and you can imagine what would happen in these referenda. Or we could consider to make a step back, like toward a northern euro and a southern euro, or there are some other models. But the problem of this incomplete currency union is still around. Secondly, and more recently, there is a core contradiction, not only in Europe, far beyond European borders, between trade and protectionism, or mercantilism, or however you want to call it. So the idea, originally not a very new one, but suggested by David Ricardo ages ago, that trade on balance is a good thing because each country can concentrate on those things which it can produce particularly well and can exchange them against other products from other countries, right? Is not so fancy today anymore as it used to be, because some politicians perceive, for example, a trade deficit as a weakness. Why should it be a weakness when American consumers buy German cars is an interesting question. What is weak about it? And there are other questions which are interesting. But when you have reactions right now that trade agreements are cancelled, are renegotiated, or are ignored, then those countries and organizations which are particularly dependent on trade, bracket open EU, bracket closed, and China, by the way, have a lot of thinking to do, because how do they react on that? They are dependent on imports and exports. Next point is a demographic one. Most of Europe is dramatically aging. You wouldn't guess when you look around in this room, but actually, believe me, it is the case. Germany has a reproduction rate of 1.34 or 1.35. When you want to keep a society stable, you need 2.1. On the other hand, in Africa and in some parts of Asia, you have societies where half of the population is younger than 25. And the social consequences of these opposed demographics are very, very diverse in terms of what you need for labor markets, what you need in terms of education, what you need for economic development, and other things. In particular, we have to think about welfare here, because aging with unchanged social welfare entitlements is probably not working. You cannot have a society where you have ever less young people and keep the social entitlement stable. So there is something what we have to think about here. Another thing, which is very important not only for Europe but also for Europe, is that we are all facing huge technological progress in the next 5 to 10 years, especially in the areas of automatization and artificial intelligence. Complete professional skills and jobs are going to disappear. In 7 years, there won't be any professional drivers around in Europe. For what? You have automatically driving cars. You don't need bus drivers. You don't need taxi drivers. You don't need car drivers, right? And even in the high skill level, you will have cyborgs as surgeons who are much more precise than human beings. So you can try to postpone that, or you can try to prevent that, but at the end of the day, it's not going to work. So these technologies will come, and the question is, how can we react on time and not too late in terms of trying to introduce retraining programs for workers which will lose their traditional jobs, or come up with other recipes. And finally, we have to think, I guess, more than in the past about data, right? You all know the 5 big data information companies, agglomerates in the United States, and the issues with privacy, and that is in Europe also a particular sensitive issue, because much more than in the United States, Europeans have a liking for keeping their data and keeping them private. So, these 5 plus 5, 10 challenges, political and economic ones, are serious, and on some of them we don't have good answers at this moment. But when you would ask me, I would argue that the next issue, which is this one, is arguably the most serious out of all of them. And so let me spend a few minutes on the issue of populism and explain how we may understand that in a proper way. So the first question is, what is it? First of all, and now I come back to what I told you before about the rising feelings of uncertainty about many people. Uncertainty fuels populism. The more uncertainty people have, the easier it is for populists to gain support. What they promise is the same, no matter in the Philippines or in the United States or in the UK, when we talk about Brexit, or in Hungary or in Poland, doesn't matter. Everywhere the same. The deal is simplifying answers on very complex problems and challenges. Very simplifying answers on very complex problems. What also is interesting is that a lot of the attractiveness of populism has not to do with some kind like ideological message, which is mostly not there, but populism often is a discursive style, a style of talking, a way of talking. When you are sitting in a TV studio on whatever topic and are discussing with people who consider themselves who are populists, you will experience interesting things. For example, they shout at you. They cut you off. They are uncivilized. They are rude. And then it is your turn, and you have to consider carefully, how do you react on that? Do you respond in kind? Do you yell back? Do you also shout? Or do you say no? Like Michelle Obama, we don't go that low. They may, but we don't. So, and then you say to the moderator, oh, sorry, I was not done yet. I have to add something, may I? That looks weak, right? So how do you react in this kind of situation? That is a very important question, and we don't really have good answers on that in many cases so far. Another thing which is important to realize is that increasingly we have a merging between so-called right and left-wing populism. If you don't believe that, because you want to keep your own identity pure and fine, You may go and look at TV discussions of Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders in the last US election campaign. You may go to Syriza and Podemos in Greece and in Spain and compare it with Front National and other more rightist kind of movements, and you find that there are surprising similarities. You also look at the movement of voters between different of these movements, and you find that easily they move from one side to the other side, but basically the messages remain the same or very similar. So that is also an important point. And it is a very broad phenomenon. You find it in all those areas and in many more countries than I put here on the slide. So it is not limited to one continent or one country or whatever. Unfortunately, the demand is growing for this kind of populism. And this demand side, I think, is a crucial one. Some people say we just need a little bit more time. Sooner or later, Mr. Trump will be gone. So what? Will the desire for populism also be gone? I don't think so. So the demand for these kind of messages and these kind of political offers will stay around. So we need an answer on that. And that is when we focus just on some individual politicians or individual people, and their behavior and their messages, however disgusting it is, just to wait until they are gone is not a solution. The demand is still there, and there will be others who will offer similar answers in the future. And then, what are the issues populists are suggesting? And surprisingly, they are very, very similar in almost all societies and all kinds of contexts. Number one is they see an internal dichotomy between the elites and the real people. And they always keep saying that the elites are betraying the real interests of the real people. Never mind that most of the populists themselves have an elitist background, right? But the message is still clear. Number two, the mainstream media notoriously are lying. And you, the people, you cannot trust them. Number three, transnational trade kills jobs. Which is true. What they forget to mention is that yes, many jobs get lost by transnational agreements, but also many new jobs are created. So they only tell you half of the truth, right? That is related to what I said before, that we have to think about retraining people, retraining workers who probably may lose their jobs. Number four, unregulated immigration is bad. Number five, the EU is evil. Obviously not in Canada and America, but in Europe that is the message. Not in the Philippines either. And multilateralism has failed. So here you have the core list with the messages you can find almost in all countries and societies where you have populists. It is surprisingly stable and does not change much. And then you can ask a very simple question. Okay, they have lots of critiques, no trade, no immigration, no transborder trade, no transborder immigration, no EU. So what do they suggest? And here we also have a very simple and seemingly plausible answer, which is national borders have to be strengthened. And that we only can do when we regain our sovereignty and leave international agreements, unions, EU, whatever. And when we do that, and maybe if necessary, we also can build some fences and some walls here and there, right? The problems will be solved. how you can regain your sovereignty in a globalizing world, they don't mention. But this is the core question, right? Sovereignty is a concept which was invented 2,500 years ago in the ancient Greek city-states, where it made sense. And people, maybe up until the 19th century, could plausibly talk about some level of sovereignty. But in a globalizing world, it is more a fantasy than reality. And this is a hollow promise. But many people believe in it. The question is, what answers do we have? And that is something which is a very important question, especially in an environment of academics, of liberals, of media people, of intellectuals, right? Do we have any kind of answers? And a related question is, which I would love to address a little bit more deeply in the discussion when you want, what kind of mistakes did we make ourselves to strengthen populism? Particularly, what social groups did we disregard and even ignore to some extent because we were catering rather other social groups? And the reflection of that is many election results we know by now. Finally, a few ideas and remarks about possible outlooks. It is clear, I guess, after what I said so far, that uncertainties are not disappearing, not anytime soon. So we have to learn how to live with them, not to get rid of them. They will stay around. I think that may be possible, but we should not expect that whatever we do, we can make them disappear. The United States will remain powerful in relative terms, but it is suffering for the unforeseeable future from serious domestic gridlocks. Already in the Obama time and the Bush times, the efficiency and effectiveness of agreements between the executive and the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives was very, very low. And that is what we still can observe today. That is an inbuilt problem. And we have extremely, extremely unilateral sentiments in the population. So all those people who run around and say the Americans are warmongers, they want to invade here, invade there, and whatever, completely disregard the unpopularity of that. The people don't want it anymore. They have experienced Vietnam, they have experienced Afghanistan, they have experienced Iraq, and other, as they see it, failures, right? And they have enough of that. So don't believe people who say the Americans are preparing new interventions here and there and there. The people, the ordinary people, just do not want that. So that is a very important context factor we should be aware of. Russia, very close to the Baltics, will remain a middle power. Mr. Obama was right. If he was right in saying so, can be considered, but the message is right. Based exclusively on energy rents. 2/3 of the Russian GDP is generated by energy. Carbon-based energy, not renewables. By exporting it, most of all. This is not a viable business plan. Half of the Russian cabinet tells you it is not a viable business plan. But they are not going to change it. Because changing the dependency on carbon-based energy, what means diversifying the economy, very well also may mean diversifying not only the economy, but also the society. And that is particularly something the current ruling group does not want, with a reason. Increasingly, we are realizing, as I put it here, a quite lax attitude toward rules. Today we had a new case of Russian GRU attempts to attack chemical laboratories in the Netherlands. The same happened last week, in Switzerland. And before in the UK. And if we talk about armament, if we talk about poisoning people, or if we talk about state-organized and sponsored doping in sports, it is the same topic. It is rule violation. That's going to stay also as long as these people are around. China is heading toward a hard authoritarianism domestically. I could give you many examples because I run programs in China as well, which is a big pity. You can talk about the enforced necessity for foreign companies to accept Communist Party cells. NGOs also have to accept, Western NGOs to accept Communist Party cells. The VPE clients are switched off, so you cannot access blocked web pages. The social credit numbers are spread all over China, where everything what you do at your workplace, in the neighborhood, in the social networks, in your financial activities is registered. And when you fall below a certain minimal level of points, you cannot book flight tickets and train tickets anymore. And you cannot send your kids to the best schools and kindergartens anymore. That is something George Orwell could even not imagine. So that is implemented step by step, which is worrisome. The EU and Germany are, over the last 30 years, slightly growing in their relevance, also internationally. You can see that when you look at a phenomenon we call clubbing, like these informal clubs. For example, the 5+1 agreement with Iran is an example of clubbing. The EU was participating, Germany was participating, right? And you have more and more of these kind of informal settings where the EU and Germany are participating. So we can say there is some kind of rising influence, but still both are far away from playing a leading relevant role globally. And populism will remain. Last slide. In more concrete terms, we have to think about carefully if we want to let it slip when what I called before the liberal global order, which has been established after the Second World War, if that is gradually eroding, if we want to let it happen or not. And I think we are very well advised to think about it if there will be a better alternative. If not, I rather would stand for this one, instead of inventing something which no one knows how it will look like. That sounds a little bit abstract, but please think about it. Never before in the last 40, 50 years, this order was so much in danger as now. Many people, especially young people, have an assessment about certain things and people and organizations and whatever, depending on the coolness factor. So it may be funny for you, but I really suggest to think more about how to add more coolness to the EU. It was a cool project when it was founded. It was extremely cool to have actions against the Schlagbaum between two countries, right? So I think we should think along these lines how to add more coolness to Europe. Definitely, there has to be a very serious shift to a more autonomous defense capability of the EU. When it is only halfway true what I told you before, on the one hand side, an increasing tendency to violate existing rules to our east. Simultaneously, a less credible American security guarantee. We do not have an alternative. But we cannot rely on the Eastern partners or neighbors, and when we cannot rely on the Western partners or neighbors, what remains except that we intensify our own capabilities? I do not see an alternative to that. But it will cost. We cannot have it for free. Europe, particularly West Europe, was free riding for 40 years, expecting that whatever is happening, Americans will come and help us. That is not necessarily the case anymore. So we have to think how to react in this kind of situation. Migration, I think, has to be addressed very pragmatically and soberly. Quick checks of asylum seekers. The procedures are way too long in most countries, which is not acceptable. Removal of denied applicants and rational channels and avenues for skilled workers. And to do it quickly and to do it decisively. We also need an industrial policy where the Commission and the Council of Ministers set incentives for European solutions for new technologies. The dependency in this area on other countries, especially on China, is also something which is not good in the future when we want a balanced development for the EU. And increasingly, that is something what started already. I think it is a good idea to look around for like-minded partners for Europe. I gave you a couple of examples here, right? When you find, from a European perspective, alliances of the willing, which share European convictions and values and orientations and rules, that may be a big advantage. Yep. So that is my introduction. I think I stuck to 45 minutes. That was kind of the time limit I had. Thank you so far for your attention, and now I'm all yours for your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for really interesting lecture, and I'm sure for 100% that the audience have a lot of questions and comments, but I'm the moderator and I have such a pleasure to ask first question. Actually, I have 3 questions related with history lessons, with present situation and with future scenarios. So, during the roundtable discussion devoted to the book After the Europe, Professor Ivan Krastev also described populism as one of the most important challenges for the EU project and for the European society in the 21st century. What do you think? What are the most important mistakes did we make while permitting populism rising? So, this is the first question. The second question, actually, I would like to ask you about Berlin political and economic elite attitude to EU challenges, and does Berlin elite have some clear agenda or maybe a few possible scenarios how EU should live for 5 or 10 years according to the Berlin point of view? And the third question, during the public lecture at Stanford University 3 years ago, you also talked about the most important challenges for the EU project. And if I understand you correctly, 3 years ago, the most important concluding remark was EU probably will overcome all these challenges. What do you think about today? We should be more optimistic or more pessimistic in comparison with 2016 situation?
Thank you very much. Let me start with the mistake question. I follow along the broad lines of a colleague of mine who is working at Columbia University. His name is Mark Lilla. 1 week after the American elections, in November of 2016, he published a short comment in the New York Times, and later he did a book out of that. And his basic idea is that the classical liberal leftist parties, both in Europe and in the United States, the Democrats, committed a grave mistake. And according to Lilla, this mistake was mostly to increasingly ignore the core interests of the traditional workers and instead supported mostly the interests of minority groups and offered to these groups more and more entitlements. What kind of minority groups? Legal entitlements for immigrants, legal entitlements for women, which is not a minority, but for women who are represented in the boards of corporations, legal entitlements for gay people to marry, and the final nail in the coffin was legal entitlements for transgender people by offering the third bathroom. And his core idea is when you focus so much on these particular groups, not in the sense of tolerating different behavior, but offering entitlements, that is a clear signal to the classical workers that you couldn't care less. And the classical workers understood. And they reacted with this kind of voting behavior, what we have seen. I think there is a lot of plausibility in what he has to say. Again, I'm not criticizing any of these kind of suggestions, but when you focus exclusively or overwhelmingly on these kind of groups and their issues in terms of entitlements, then maybe you should not be surprised when the working class goes somewhere else. I think that is the most plausible thing I encountered as for this mistake question. Is there a Berlin elite with a clear agenda? That is a very easy one, no. Not even close. Compared to my Stanford lecture, the number of challenges has grown. So I think I mentioned 5, and now I mentioned 10. When we would have the time, we could go through them one by one, and I probably would say in 50% of these challenges, there is a fair chance to get some improvement over time. But probably for the other 50%, I would rather say, like in the case of terrorism, where I said that explicitly, that unfortunately we'll probably have to accept it as a new normal. And that is also true for a couple of other cases.
Mėly Atviros Lietuvos fondo bičiuliai, jūs turit galimybę paklausti profesoriaus?
Thank you very much. My question is just to continue with this populism and uncertainty, the case or phenomena, even I would say, of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Now you have basically 2 different approaches about his case. One is, let's say, unconditional, I will say, official European Union. Then how they are saying, you are now dealing with 2 Viktor Orbans. One Viktor Orban 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and then second Viktor Orban. And then 25 years ago, 30, whatever, Viktor Orban was one of the most pro-European, pro-NATO, pro-Western politicians in Hungary. At that time I was studying there. I mean, he was really against the Soviet Union and then Moscow, I mean, Russia for, I mean, independence of Hungary, to include Hungary into both of those 2 structures, I mean, of the Western structures in NATO and then European Union. And his participation in this process is really, how to say, immense. And then you have today what is basically Viktor Orban like the most black sheep in the whole system. And then official explanation, I would say, official explanation from European Union is, first of all, you are dealing with two Viktor Orbans, and then why he changed the side? Because of, Putin. Putin is paying him. He became basically Putin troller. And then you have alternative viewpoint. One example, Diana Johnson, American researcher, now living in Paris. She wrote an article about exactly this case, month and a half ago, published on Global Research website of Professor Hosudovsky. Now, how she is explaining, no, this is a wrong approach. You are dealing with the same person. This is one Viktor Orban. There are no two Viktor Orbans. But you are dealing with the same, his political goals. And 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and today, he didn't change the policy. What is his political goal or national goal? If you want, this is independence for Hungary. And 30 years ago, he was fighting for independence, and today, he's fighting for independence. Now, if it is, let's say, this second approach, right, then, according to her opinion, and maybe in mine as well, the wrongness is on the side of the European Union. Basically, European Union, with such policy, is creating those Viktor Orbans. What means, from this point of view, the policy of European Union has to be changed in order not produce more of those Viktor Orbans, and even if you want, Brexit. Now also people are saying about French exit and Italy exit and whatever. Now simply my question is, Orban between independence of Hungary and, let's say, Moscow money?
I found that an interesting idea with these two victors. You know the meaning of victor, right? Normally there can be only one victor, right? When you have a conflict or a fight. But I think today there is only one left. And this victor, who was really a liberal victor, and played a significant role when it came to the social and political changes in Hungary 30 years ago. I guess this victor is probably not around anymore. What is surprising maybe is that he is so popular with his rhetoric and his kind of ideas about Hungarian development. Illiberal democracy is one of his big dreams that is close to Putin, is that it does not really fit into the general picture of Hungary's membership advantages. I think when many people in Hungary would exactly understand what the advantages are of membership in material senses and in immaterial senses, they would be more careful. Hungary profits a lot from different funds of the EU. I'm not sure that many Hungarians understand that. The one point which I think we may understand to some extent, not only in Hungary, is that the situation for some countries in East Central Europe is more difficult than for West European countries, because all of these countries either were part of the Soviet Union until 1991 or had a already limited sovereignty in East Central Europe from 1945 or 1949 to 1989, 1990. So then they became sovereign out of a sudden, formally sovereign, right? Just to a few years later become members of the EU, which then again was accompanied by limited sovereignty, but voluntarily, but still. And this experience, just to regain your sovereignty and a few years later to give it up again, I think that is not so easy to digest in some of these societies. And I guess that also plays some role in the Hungarian case and in the case of some other countries. So I think we should understand that, which does not mean that we should appreciate it. Because the limitations on sovereignty in the EU, I hope, are perceived by you different from the limitations of sovereignty Lithuania was exposed to from the end of the Second World War to the end of the Cold War. So I think that are different things. But it plays a certain role in many societies in East Central Europe, I guess. I like this analogy with the two victors, but I'm afraid today only one is left. And that is that one who is openly praising the liberal democracy and tries to find allies for that, not only in Europe, but also in China, for example. Hungary is one of the most active members in the 16+1 format, which was created by China, which includes the Visegrad countries and the West Balkans. And there is a clear attempt also to split a little bit and to weaken the EU. So I'm very skeptical about that.
Ar norinčių dar paklausti profesoriaus?
Thank you, Professor. Of course, nobody knows for sure political I don't know, installations in nowadays world, but I have heard several contradictions in your lecture, and that's, of course, very normal. But to the very end, I was listening to your notion of sovereignty and the notion, concept of nation states as if it was 19th century connotation. And then you finally, with this outlook that we have now here on the screen, suggested as if that the world order should be changed, and instead of two equilibrium or balancing powers, US and Russia, the powers of Cold War and after war, as if should be changed into a triple system. United States, that we are uncertain now of, Russia, and European Union or Europe, which is, I am reading down your message, which is not that liberal democracy as we understand liberal democracies now. That's your first bullet point. The second bullet point, rather populist European Union, because it should be cool and caring. And the third thing is that we should have strong defense, because now we are the third power, the European Union, and we are uncertain if US will give money for defense or the NATO Article number 5 will be enacted. Also, this European Union will be a bullet point with closed borders for the migrants. Next bullet point is industrial power we will have from our homegrown technologies, quite closed and industry and economy. Also, we will try somehow to distract traditional to the US, for example, partners like Mexico, and also attract India from BRIC. It means from BRIC, where is Brazil, Russia, so forth. And also, as if you are suggesting the sovereignty of EU, but not suggesting the nation states sovereignty of now existing nation states. Can you elaborate on those contradictions?
Well, I try my best. I think the core, from what you said, for me, the most important thing is the issue of sovereignty. And I have to admit that for many years, for a very long time, I'm not a great believer into sovereignty. I'm not saying I don't like it, but I'm saying it's not working anymore. Because we are not living in the 19th century, where you have only alliances of countries or strong single countries or whatever, who can claim that they can kind of defend some notion of sovereignty. In a globalized world, that is not possible. Because I briefly mentioned these global flows, which are border crossing, right? And when it comes to capital flows, when one country has a certain notion of capital flows and tries to introduce a certain regime of taxation, for example, or of investment support or whatever, and the neighboring countries don't do it, it just does not work. It does not work. When one country wants in a sovereign way fight climate change, that's a mirage. It cannot work. So wherever you look, if it is defense, if it is ecology, if it is capital flows, if it is content flows, like regulation of internet or whatever, doing things by yourself in a sovereign way mostly does not work anymore, no matter if we like it or not. So I think that is a notion which is very important for me as a starting point. And when you have this kind of idea that no matter if as a person you would like it differently, but it's not the case, sovereignty does not work, then the idea of the EU becomes much stronger, because the EU has the core prerequisite that countries voluntarily transfer sovereignty from their national governments upward to the EU. And that is exactly what the core idea is. And while it does not work everywhere, and sometimes it fails, as I try to say, in many policy fields, in many instances, it does work. So when we would not have the EU today, it would be so desperately required to have one that I think we should be more careful with what we have, what we still have, right? So that is my core idea, that the classical notion of sovereignty, if you go to Sparta and Athens, or if you go to Metternich, or if you go to Kissinger or whatever, no matter what you think about it in theory, it does in this real world not work anymore. So the question is, how can you then go for political solutions? And I think the EU is one of the best answers we have. So therefore, there may be contradictions, I don't know, here or there. Mao Zedong, I think it was, who says, all good solutions arise from contradictions. But I think this core message, that I do not believe anymore in sovereignty today, and that the EU is a relatively good response on that, I don't see the contradiction here.
We have a few questions.
Go ahead, take your time.
On the way.
Thanks a lot. So I'm from workers' family and have a question about your relaunch. Does it mean that you want a relaunch like a neoliberalism? That means a system that crashed 10 years ago. And this means, like we have in Germany now, a problem that normal people couldn't buy flats in Berlin or somewhere else. And that the feeling of people become stronger and stronger, that the gap between poor and rich is increasingly rapidly, and we have research about this. Or do you mean it like a new system with regulation from state, like this new taxes or transaction taxes and so on, so with a strong role of the state?
When I talked about this relaunch, I did not think most of all about the content of any policy, but about the institutional setting, especially with those organizations and those rules which I tried to mention, like the United Nations, which are far away from being perfect, but I don't see a better alternative so far. Or also the World Bank and the IMF, which sometimes experience policy changes. So when you criticize some structural adjustment policies, for example, from the World Bank in certain periods of time, you also can figure out that later or earlier they also have different policy sets. So I'm not so much talking about the content, I'm talking about the framework here. Because I'm troubled that when we give up on this framework, without having an alternative or a substitute at hand, so that the international landscape would be more chaotic than it is already today, I cannot see much advantages there. How we fill this framework then, once it can be saved or modified but still kept on, with what kind of policy recipes or solutions, that is a different debate. I didn't want to participate in that one. My point is here to keep the framework instead of giving it up and then having even less organizations, institutions, certainties than we have now.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture and actually really well structured. That's what I really liked about it. Could you return to that picture that you told about debate between populists and mainstream politicians? And my question was that when you were saying that populists in those discussions...
This one or the next one?
This one. When populists discuss with the mainstream politicians, they are strong in the discussion. They use bad manners in the discussions, right? What would you suggest to mainstream politicians? What emotions should they embrace to become strong in those discussions?
Hold on, keep it for a second. As a viewer of infotainment shows or whatever talk shows where different people are present, right? And you are watching that from home, sitting on the sofa and on a chair, whatever. What kind of reaction would impress you?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, stability and good manners would impress me, but I'm not assuming that applies to everyone.
So you would advocate that people behave in a civilized way, that they don't shout back, that they don't interrupt, right, and try to make their point.
I would like that.
You know what kind of... Personally, I tend to agree, but you know what kind of media landscape we are facing here? When I go to a talk show, the first thing, even not the moderator, but the assistants of the moderator tell you is, at the end of today's show, you don't come and complain that you didn't have enough time. And if you want to say something, you just say it, no matter who else is talking. You understand because the assumption is, the inbuilt assumption is, that we are not talking about enlightenment programs here, or educational programs. We are talking about a show. And that people, the viewers, appreciate when it is a little bit on the rough side, right? And I'm not so sure if that is mistaken. And when you have this kind of assumption, it makes the answer more complicated. When I'm in a talk show, I'm not talking to my colleagues. I'm even not talking to my students. I'm talking to people out there on their chairs at home who probably find it boring when you just have a civilized exchange of arguments. And when you take that, when you try to price that into your kind of behavior, I think that is quite complicated to find some kind of adequate strategy here.
So does that lead to the conclusion that all mainstream politicians should behave as populists?
I'm not as a policy advisor here. Some do. A majority tries not to do. Some have certain other strategies of being very insistent and very stubborn, but without shouting or whatever. But personally, I find that this formal side of behavior, look at the American president, right? That is a person which by normal civilized standards would not be elected for anything, even not as director of a kindergarten. But all election campaign, he behaved like that. And the premium was, he was elected. I remember I was many months during this election campaign in the US. I talked to my American colleagues. First, he was a candidate, right? Most of my colleagues in America said, this guy never, ever will become a candidate for the Republicans. Then he became a candidate. And then they went like, this guy never, ever will be elected president. And then he became president. And then they went like, don't worry, this guy will be balanced by checks and balances by other organizations, other institutions, and so. And what happens? Step by step, he implements his election program. To a surprising extent, his election points are implemented. So he manages to move, right? So my question to all of us is, how come that we are so weak in anticipating tipping points beyond which major changes are happening? And we keep saying all the time it's not going to happen. But it is. Yeah, there is a two-finger sign. I don't know if you want to behind you.
From this point of view, you are coming from Germany. Now explain to all of us how Adolf Hitler won in 33. I mean, he received 33%. Even when he was running against Hitler, he received 45%, Hitler 55%.
Yes. Well, that's a very famous discussion. There are Robert Kagan and other people in the US who are frequently now, in the last couple of months, making comparisons between 1933 and 1938 and the current situation. I think I would not reject that out of hand. I think on the surface, when you look at 1938 and the Munich conference, right, and certain things in the last years between Western and Russian negotiations, there are some surface similarities. But at the same time, I would not go as far as making an equation that it is exactly the same. The historical circumstances are quite different. But you have a point, then you say on the surface there are some similarities. I guess that's true, yes.
Yeah, I have one remark and one question. First of all, remark is about that, again, populism and relaunching, confronting populism, and exactly that very discursive level you named it. I think that, yeah, the style and the form is crucial and very important here, but I think the content still is of more importance. I think that one of the main reasons and symptoms at the same time of the process and things we call as populism in Europe, all around the world, is that the consensus is lost about some very important and fundamental things about democracy, freedom, human rights, rule of law, tolerance. These issues, these notions and those ideas are no more like self-understandable, disputable. More and more people, more and more bigger and bigger parts of the society are just claiming that there are the several forms of democracy, for example. You liberals, you Western Europe have your own democracy, we Poles and we Hungarians have our own sovereign, so to say, as Russian claims sovereign democracy. What I want to say, there is a disruption in that idea level. And on the one hand, other hand, and at the same time, that liberal trajectory, classical parties, classical elites, mainstream politicians, you name it, they lost ability to speak with those, so to say, other parts of the society. They lost the ability to communicate with them about the crucial importance of those things. I think that this ability to communicate with the society from the part of so-called traditional classical parties and politicians on that discursive and idea level must be restored. This is in my opinion, of crucial importance. So that was the remark. The question is, of course, about Russia. There are, like, very roughly two concepts confronting in the West and not only in the West, what to do with the Russian dictatorship, so to say. What should be the reaction if, mostly in that ideal case, imagine all the people in the West, for example, suddenly have the common opinion, common political will, what to do with, how to confront or how to react to the Russian dictatorship. So what the model do you prefer, so to say, or are more fond of it? Should this dictatorship be confronted with more and more positions of power, slowly and certainly strangled by the economic sanctions, political isolation, and the main goal should be the disintegration of the dictatorship, decline and collapse? Or should it be like, should the West flirt with it, like try to even preserve it, because the collapse and the disintegration of this dictatorship is even more dangerous thing than its state and its policy today? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I limit myself to your question, though it is also intriguing to say something on your first point. So the Russia issue. My favorite strategy, which I also actively advocate when it comes to my own government, is ignore. Because when there is anything, what this very small group from 8 to 12 people and the center of power wants desperately, it is international acceptance. And I would suggest to deny that. And here I have a deep conflict with some of my colleagues who were active participants during the Cold War and now want to tell us we have a new Cold War. I very much disagree. This is not a new Cold War. The old Cold War was embedded into bipolarity. Today we have many things, but not bipolarity. The old Cold War was embedded into certain ideological fights. Today we don't have this kind of ideological fights. And I also would argue, still remembering, the first time I went to the Soviet Union was in 1971. I have some kind of first-hand experience. I think that the vast period of the Soviet time after the Second World War was much more convenient and much more easier to manage than what we are having today. So I actually think the situation is more serious today. This leadership is less reliable, it can be less calculated, it is much more difficult to accommodate in case someone wants to do that, and I think we need different tools and different responses and not those from the Cold War. So I think that is completely misleading. And what I'm suggesting is a double strategy. One is a very careful setting of certain lines in the sand, but just a few. But those which are defined have to be enforced. The worst thing we can do is to define red lines which are crossed without consequences, as we have seen in Syria a couple of times. So carefully set a couple of red lines and be ready to enforce them. And otherwise, don't talk. There is nothing to talk about, because we know exactly what the situation and motivation is in Moscow and this group, and they know that we don't agree with that. So what are you going to talk about? So that would be my answer on that. And the second point is, we need some patience for waiting for regime change, but from the inside, not from the outside. We are not talking about a regime which has grabbed power against the will of the people. 85% of the people support the power. We shouldn't forget that. So masterminding regime change from abroad is not a good idea. It is futile, it probably will not work, and it is wasting resources. And it will come. Already now there are cracks in the wall. They may not be effective soon when we talk about regime change, but the truck drivers 2 years ago, the manipulated elections and the consequences on the Bolotnia demonstrations, and more recently the changes of retirement age, have significant repercussions inside the society. And the one-sided dependence on oil prices, which they cannot influence at all, when you are dependent to such an extent on oil prices on the world markets, which you cannot impact, right? And then you go down from a $135 per barrel to $30 per barrel. Now it's up again, up to 90, but you cannot calculate it. that is a recipe for failure and not for success. So I think there will be changes. I cannot tell you how soon, but we should not get involved into regime change from the outside. It has to happen from the inside. And otherwise, don't talk, don't interact, ignore, but have a couple of red lines in the sand and be ready to enforce them. That is my answer.
We are running out of time. To be honest, we are working 1 hour and 40 minutes. But if you don't mind, I will give an opportunity to ask you one and very last question.
You can take 2 more.
Okay.
Oh, nice. I can. Oh. Is it on? Yeah, no, it's on. It's on, no?
Yeah, very much.
Okay. I can also stand up. My question would be a bit about for solving also populism, where was also mentioned already. I mean, I think we faced already a possibility how to manage populism and how to overcome it, even in a way. This is a bit dangerous, and this is because I want to put it also in the discussion. We observed, also in Germany, we observed in a short time also when we had the candidate Schulz, but just short time the pulse went up because he was quite authentic, quite charismatic, whatever. So I think one thing to beat populism is in a way to be also a bit more lively and a bit more, also talking a bit more normal sentences maybe when you get closer to the people, but not always. But I think this authentic or charismatic dealing, it has also some problems. But we saw, for example, in France, that works quite well. And I just want to ask you about the question and maybe also the risks about this charismatical leaders that even can overcome Front National or whatever right populist movement. Or we had it also a bit in Austria, but it was different. So just a question. I mean, what is the chance of charismatic leaders maybe against populist parties, and what is also the danger on it?
I'm not principally opposed to charismatic people. Sometimes they are quite entertaining, right? But I think the combination of having charisma and suggesting simplifying answers which cannot work, so this combination is toxic. So it all depends how you use, for what kind of purposes, and in what way are you using your charisma. And when you are using it like Duterte or Orban or whatever, it is one thing. When you use it and try, I know it is difficult to tell the people that things are really difficult to solve and there is no quick fix, but still we have to try it in this way, ABC. I think that's a different type of charisma. So I think I don't have a general problem with being charismatic when it is properly used.
I think that this is the time to say thank you very much, dear Professor, for full of fresh ideas lecture, and I strongly believe that we should repeat your statement. We should be careful with what we have. So thank you very much. Ir aš taip pat noriu padėkoti Jums visiems, kad buvot čia ir primint, kad bus ir daugiau diskusijų apmąstant Europą paskaitų ir diskusijų cikle, tai iki greito pasimatymo.